So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yuval Shani, and I'm very happy to now formally open the ESIL 2018 Jerusalem Research Forum. We had a side event yesterday, and we had pre-conference sessions this morning, but now it's the real thing. So first, I have to start with an apology on behalf of our dean, Michael Cariani, who was supposed to come here and speak, but he couldn't make it after all. He did ask me to convey to you all his greetings. This is a holiday here, and things are a bit irregular, but for us, it's of course business time. This is the fourth. I think this is the fourth research forum since the format was relaunched in Florence in 2015. And as you all know, it's a unique format for ESIL because it is targeted particularly, not exclusively, but particularly at early career scholars. And we are very proud to be hosting this event in Jerusalem. And this is the first major ESIL event that we have held here. And as a representative of the local organizers, I wish to thank the ESIL board for accepting our proposal to hold the forum here. We realized it was not a run-of-the-mill decision for the board to hold a conference in a country which has been associated with many international law violations, in a city which is among the most contested places on this planet. But many of us, international lawyers who teach and practice law in the region, believe that it is this very engagement with the local constituencies, with academics, with practitioners, and especially with local early career professionals that makes holding the forum here exceptionally valuable. We at the law faculty here, we understand our mission as an attempt to promote the rule of law in these troubled regions under conditions of disorder and contestation. And we find the support of ESIL of this mission and the anticipated intellectual output of this forum as an extremely useful exercise. So thank you all for participating in this forum, and we hope and believe that the vibrant and charged atmosphere in Jerusalem, which some of you already experienced yesterday when you took the tour, and those of you who have participated in the side event have sensed the kind of contestation that is taking on here. I hope it will also serve to stimulate our own discussions within the research forum. Today, as you have may noticed, if you walk around the streets of Jerusalem, again, it's not an ordinary day, it's a holiday. It's the holiday of Purim. Purim is an interesting holiday for international lawyers because it commemorates a failed genocide that was planned against the Jews of Persia in the 5th century BC. More controversially, I should note, the Jews prevailed and exacted revenge on their enemies, massacring thousands of them, according to the text. Anyway, this reversal of fortunes underlies the tradition to wear customs on these days. So you would see when you walk around the streets, many people, especially children, were wearing customs. So as to underscore the notion that things are not what they appear to be at first sight. So it is interesting because we are seeing, in a way, history repeating itself here and in other places around the world, victims becoming victimizers, fortunes changing, and things not being what they appear to be. And the questions that we are dealing in this forum are indeed not new. And they pertain to issues such as, can international law operate under conditions, radical conditions of disorder? And every one of us who have been following the media in the last few days cannot be oblivious to what's happening a few hundred kilometers north of us in Ghouta, Syria. And we are also asking ourselves, can international law withhold or contain the legitimizing pressures that are brought about against it in the process of contestation? And I think it was very interesting last night, those of us who participated in the side event, to hear the very interesting disagreement as to whether international law is the only objective yardstick which allows us to evaluate a highly politicized situation, or whether it is itself hopelessly politicized. I'm sure that our discussions today and tomorrow will bring to the table many other original and interesting insights. So I wish to close my opening remarks by thanking ESIL board, and in particular the two presidents of ESIL, the current president, Luis Hinojosa, and also his predecessor, Andre Nolkamper, who will be joining us, inshallah, today. Both of them played a very important role in making the Jerusalem Forum possible. And I also want to thank Joyce. Where's Joyce? Joyce Davis, the administrative director of ESIL, for excellent cooperation throughout the process of organizing this forum. I also thank my colleagues on the organizing committee, Christina Binder. Where's Christina? Tomer Brody. Tomer? This is not a roll call. I'm just want to recognize Pierre Dargent. Okay, Pierre. Guy Arpaz. There is Guy. Moshe Hirsch. And Yael. I haven't seen Yael Ronen here, but she will join us soon, I'm sure. So I thank all of them, and also our indefatigable organizing staff, Tal Mimran. We've done the real legwork here. Tal is a PhD himself, PhD student who's writing on international law, is our expert on everything related to ISIS and beyond. And also Omri Shalev. Where is Omri? Omri is outside?
Taking care of the air conditioner.
Okay, so Omri is taking care of the climate change here in this room. And thanks also, Omri. Omri is an LLB candidate in the law faculty, and they've been assisted throughout this week by two of our students, Yarden and Yara. Thank you, guys. So just a couple of housekeeping issues before turning the floor to Louise. The conference proceedings are all being recorded. We are not live broadcasting, but we are recording everything. If for some reason you don't want us to upload your intervention online at some point in time, let the organizers know and we will address this. But we think this could be a valuable resource for those researchers who have not joined us here. And the other housekeeping issue which I want to draw your attention here, as we have sent all the contributors an invitation to consider to submit their papers not only to the SSRN series that ESIL is organizing, but also to the Israel Law Review. And you have in your packets, and you have actually received these letters of invitation from the three editors, Yael Ronen, Malcolm Shaw, and myself. So without further ado, I will I wish for us all to have a very successful conference, and I'm now turning the floor to Louise.
Thank you very much, members of ESIL, dear colleagues, students. Let me begin by thanking Hebrew University, and in particular Yuval Shani, and the rest of the team. They have been mentioned by him, so I do not have to repeat the names. It's been a pleasure to come here, and thank you for hosting the 2018 ESIL Research Forum on International Law in Times of Disorder and Contestation. Despite this name, there has been no disorder in the organization of the Research Forum. No, I am really grateful to the organizers for the professionalism and the efficiency with which they have solved all the problems that usually arise in a kind of event like this one, and even more in these difficult times, as you have mentioned. I am particularly pleased to be here in Jerusalem with its thousands of years of history, and I am sure that all of us will enjoy this fascinating city. This research forum is objectively but particularly interesting for any international law scholar. The organizers have been so kind as to arrange, as you have mentioned, a study tour that has helped to better understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For those that went yesterday in the bus, it was a fascinating experience. I have repeated that several times, but I will do it once again. It was really valuable to understand what's happening here, and it was a brilliant tour with a brilliant guide. Thank you for that. We have also enriched the research forum with a seminar that explained to us how you practice law in a conflict zone. It's one of the situations where international law is more relevant and at the same time more difficult to implement. And it was also a very enriching experience. And the organizers have also arranged a masterclass by Larry Halfa, that has been particularly interesting. So now that we have warmed up, we are prepared to begin the research forum at full speed from the start. And the title of the conference has allowed us to draw a transversal line that cuts across very different subjects, but all of them pose challenging questions and show the tensions that international law has to face nowadays. And we will begin the research forum itself with strong starter. Basak Cali has been so kind to accept to deliver a keynote speech on international law in times of disorder and contestation, which is indirectly related to the theme of the conference. Afterwards, many things. In the first panel, we will have in one corner a pluralist reading of international adjudication, and in the other corner, a defense of international judicial deference as a response to this backlash. Don't worry, the boxing language is just a metaphor. We will also study the legitimacy of international courts in these times when the legitimation discourses proliferate and present international courts sometimes as anti-democratic institutions because they question national political decisions, national democratic decisions adopted in parliaments, in democratic parliaments. We will also deal with the implementation of human rights instruments, which, far from being a procedural issue, deeply affect the existence in practice of material rights. Let me say that I am particularly pleased to see that several papers deal with the inter-American system for the protection of human rights, which was not very well known 15 or 20 years ago and has produced very interesting judgments that have innovated the protection of human rights at the international level. We will also hear about lawmaking, we will debate about legal responses to violence, etc. In sum, an outstanding program, and I have to congratulate the Hebrew University for having been able to build it. But I think that this program is a sign of the vitality of ESIL research fora. As a research fora point to trending topics of international law, they foster research, they foster high quality research among young scholars, and it's an excellent instrument for the assessment of ongoing research, of topical research, in an enriching debate between the authors and reputed international law scholars. So thank you to everybody for attending this research forum, in particular to all the speakers, all the chairs, all the commentators for their contributions. We're looking forward to listening to you, so thank you.
Introduce you, Basak, so people know who you are. Okay, one item which Luis omitted, but I'm sure not intentionally, was the interest group meeting this morning, which was also a very, I attended the first part, which was very interesting, and I want to congratulate the International Environmental Law Group on putting together this interest group meeting. It's a very, I think it was a very good start as well. So now, without further ado, you already know the title and you already know the name of the speaker. But Basak Cali, I should say, is a professor of international law at the Hertie School of Governance, and also in Berlin, and also the director of the Center for Global Public Law at Koç University in Istanbul. I'm sure that all of you know her, have come across her writing in international law, in human rights law, and more generally about the prospects of global public law in a multi-level legal order. Basak, but for the European Society, of course, it's important to know that Basak is the Secretary General of the European Society of International Law. She's been also a fellow of the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, where she has completed her PhD in 2003, and she's been a Council of Europe expert on the European Convention on Human Rights since 2002. She has written extensively, and she's been also involved in actual litigation and in capacity development for non-governmental organizations. So, Basak, without further ado, it's great to have you here.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. When you said my name, I went like this because the name is a very Turkish name, right? It has all the syllables and all the funny letters. So when people say Çalı, Cali, Çalı, Çalı, so that's when I went like this, you know, with the name. But thank you for the Basak. And you did okay with the Çalı, I think. So the name is very Turkish. So I think keynotes are overrated. Right. So this is called a keynote lecture, and I want to start with maybe bringing down the expectations a little bit on the keynote lecture of the research forum. In particular, I say this because this is a research forum. We're here to discuss new cutting-edge research, in particular from early career researchers, but not only from early career researchers, but also from our work. So, sort of to start a research forum with some sort of a keynote. Now that I'm probably going against the organizers' sort of planning of it, I think we need to take it with a pinch of salt. We can't sort of sort out quite a lot of the issues in a keynote. What the keynote has to do is, I think, just it should be a conversation starter. And one of the things that maybe a keynote can do is to set the scene a little bit. But I'm not so sure that we can set the scene. In particular with the call for papers that you have identified for us, it's not also very easy to set the scene very easily. I find the call for papers an incredibly difficult and incredibly a challenging one. So let me just read you from the call for papers to start with. So one of the key propositions of the call for papers, and of course it's really important, sometimes we do research, we forget about the call for papers. So I hope that it's always good to come back to what do the individual projects that we will be discussing throughout these 2 days are going to relate to the call for papers. Now, one of the things that the call for papers is saying is that there's a key proposition in the call for papers, and this is very much, I think, highlighted by the word of retreat. That there is a retreat from international law, from fundamental institutions of international law, and from multilateralism. But also the call for papers is not just talking about that, but there is a hint or a concern that there's a retreat from some of the values for which international law also stands for. So it's a bit of a double retreat kind of a thing that we see in the call for papers. So not just about institutions, but there's a concern about values. And of course, the call for papers is saying, so how do we study this? How do we make sense of this? And what kind of research we do under these conditions of retreat? What are the things that we can say about these very grand claims? Now, just a year ago, now I'm going to sound a little ageist, I was talking to an old colleague of mine And he was maybe about 30 or 40 years older than me. I don't know. I don't want to judge. I don't want to tell you exactly his age. But he was older, and I felt young talking to him. I felt very young talking to this international law colleague. Just one more clue, which you can't still guess who he is, but he works on international economic law and in international trade law. And of course, I identify myself as someone who's worked a lot on international law and in international human rights law. So we were talking about this, the retreat from international institutions, and he said, exciting times. And he looked excited. He looked excited about all of these things, and he said, there are so many possibilities. There are lots of things that can change right now. This uncertainty, he says, makes me so excited. Now, I was very confused. One, I felt young, or younger than my colleague, yet I had not a single drop of excitement in me when we were having this conversation. Just moved from Istanbul to Berlin in the midst of a lot of post-coup chaos in Turkey. There was nothing that I thought would be exciting about it. And I couldn't understand why he was sort of in this kind of mode. And the feeling that I had about this retreat and the possibilities and innovation, I didn't really share any of this sort of sense of it. I will come back to it, maybe in the end, why he thinks all these were very exciting times. And actually, I still don't find it very exciting. I also don't find sort of the research that we may do about retreat to be framed in this way, a frame of a sense of excitement. But maybe it's because of my international human rights law bias. So the way that I'm reading what is happening in the system has very much to do with my own individual research projects that I've been doing for the past 20 years. And I don't see excitement from where I look to the subject. So from where I study it, it's not the word that I will capture our scholarship, where the scholarship is actually going to evolve. I also didn't feel very excited from the jurisdictions that I study. So, the excitement is not the word that I associate with studying Turkey and international law or United Kingdom and international law. So I was very interested, and I thought maybe I'm being a little bit biased about my own analysis. So maybe there are pockets of you in this room who actually are associating with this sense of excitement. So I would like to obviously hear a lot more about this, whether some of the research that you do, you actually are able to coin it as exciting, or these are exciting times for international law. But this is not sort of how I started thinking about the call for papers. My call for paper thinking was a bit, not necessarily exciting, but a little bit concerned, to say the least. Now, the first sort of thing that we do when we talk about changing times and retreat and contestation, one of the things that I do, I don't know about you as how you study these big questions and how these big events or this zeitgeist is influencing how you identify your own research projects, is that I start reading extensively from other disciplines. This is something that happens to me. I almost retreat from my own scholarship. I stop reading international law and I start reading others. There's this sort of thing about how are they making sense of these developments. So in preparation for this keynote, but not just in preparation for it, I've been reading a lot of international relations theory, a lot of political history, and also a lot of history of political economy. These are the places that I kind of went in because I just don't feel very equipped to say something super wise and super smart about the call for papers. One sense that I have is that this is beyond my methodological tools. I know a lot of small things in small pockets, but I can't make sense of the zeitgeist by reading more international law. So those are the places that I went into. So, and in preparation, again, I was thinking, well, let's understand what everyone else is saying. Not everyone else, obviously. Some of you are also IR scholars. I'm not saying you're all lawyers here, and you might be thinking about these big questions as well. But of course, the way that I thought about the call for papers is to say, what do we give to the bigger debate? How can we contribute? We are not the only ones talking about retreat and decline of multilateralism. What is it that we're going to contribute to this ongoing debate as international lawyers? Do we say anything new, anything interesting, anything exciting? Or are we just going to be repeating or echoing what others are doing, but in more fine-grained ways and so on and so forth. So let me just go back and say first, what are the big debates that people are having about this contestation, changing times, difficult times for the international legal order. IR scholars have been on this for a very long time, right? So this is nothing new, and Yuval actually highlighted that. There's something about an uncertainty in the call for papers, but this is not a new topic. And the topic is not necessarily new because, we had the Brexit and that and the other, but actually there's been a lot more literature in IR scholarship that we have entered into something else, and people are debating whether this was 2008, whether it was 2007, maybe it's 2010, but it is not necessarily a very new sort of zeitgeist that I think we're in. And the IR scholars have been saying this for quite some time. And what do they say about it? And this is here, I'd like to quote from an IR scholar, Trine Flockhart, from the University of Kent. She says, the international system appears to be in flux. And the liberal international order that was established after the Second World War is in peril. Most agree that global power is shifting as new powers rise and old ones reassert themselves, and there are arrival of new actors, but there is little agreement on what kind of international order is in the making and how to meet its many emerging challenges. So there's a very long narrative of uncertainty. And this uncertainty is not necessarily related to law or how the law is operating, but actually an uncertainty about how to understand the political dynamics. And this type of a framing of the zeitgeist, this sort of a framing of uncertainty, and we don't know what will happen, how things are changing and shifting, is something that the IR scholars have coined, and not necessarily in a very recent ways, but they've been sort of talking about this for some time. So this is sort of part of a much larger, a much more of a long-standing type of conversation. In the international sort of political economy literature, and here I must say that I've been very much influenced by the work of Danny Roderick. I don't know if this name rings a bell. He's a historian of economics a little bit, but also studies sort of the changing systems. And one of the things that he again talks about is that this changing, this uncertainty, was in the making for a much longer period of time. So, and he even traces it back and say, well, we could see that the system was actually changing and shifting by looking at economic arrangements even since the 1980s and so on. So he actually disturbs this narrative that things have started with Brexit or things have just started about 10 years ago or something, but that this is a much longer in the making of a process which he ties in with sort of the globalization and the rising of inequality, and a lot of states are sort of backlashing. The whole story of the rise of populism is nothing new, nothing sudden, but it has been in the making for a very, very long time. So again, this is a much more of a long-termist sort of an analysis that he also puts to the picture. So one question I have is, did we get it? So people have been talking about the retreat and the decline of the system in other disciplines for much longer than maybe we are talking about it. So this was one of my insights. So is this because we are a little slow in actually identifying, what's moving and what's shifting? Is it because we focus maybe too much on detail or sort of very fine-grained sort of regime analysis and so on and so forth, that maybe we have arrived in this conversation a little late? And I'm very happy to be pushed back on this. Maybe you can say, no, we were there, right? We were the first ones to actually talk about these issues. But I'm not so sure that we are the first ones to talk about some of these issues at the moment. So this is my hunch. We're a little late in responding. And you can say, well, this has to do with law. law is a little late in responding. We have this lag, things happen and then sort of we respond a little bit later. A lot of these things will have to take time, and how the law scholarship responds to it necessarily has to take more time than sort of other fields or other disciplines. Is there anything that can be done about this? Can we be more responsive to sudden changes and shifts? I don't know, and I don't also know that maybe it's necessarily a very good idea. How do we contribute to this debate, which is, one, not a new debate, and the other one, that it's an ongoing debate, and a lot of the IR scholars are also saying that they are unsure about how it will unfold. Can we be the oracles? Can we say, well, this is how it's going to work, this is how it's going to unfold? Do we have the right methodological tools to make sense of these bigger things? So these are some of the questions I think we could ask throughout the research forum about what is it that we bring to the table in discussing things which are actually not necessarily very much related to law as such. And there are much deeper social structures that are involved in some of these changes that people are actually telling us. I thought that there are three ways that international law scholarship, / activism, I don't know about that, could actually maybe contribute to some of these ongoing debates. So this is what I'd like to share with you. These are my thoughts about these three ways about where we come in. I think recognizing that maybe we're a bit latecomers to some of these discussions as well. I think the first way that we actually are able to, we can, and we have contributed to this debate is exactly about being a little slow. I think sometimes being a little slow and being a little responsive might be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. So I'd like to sort of turn what I've just said earlier, saying we were a little slow in actually arriving to this point, to say that this could actually be an advantage of our scholarship, that we are a little slow as people who study law over time in responding to some of these things. One of the advantages that we have is that maybe we're not very sensationalist. We don't say end of the Second World War regime. We don't say end of the international liberal order. Apparently at Munich conference, the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks ago, literally everyone on the podium at least said once that the liberal international order has ended, or they've made some sort of a declaration about this. And I think there's sort of, it really captures people's interests to say something is ended and something else is now starting. And there's a bit of a sensationalism in some of this literature. Because we're a little slow, and maybe we're very fine-grained in our discussions of processes over time, right? I mean, this is maybe also an advantage, that we are not maybe jumping to these types of super sexy conclusions about end of something and beginning of something else, and this is happening now, and this, that, and the other. Now, I don't know if maybe some of you are excited about these types of discourses, to declare, I was the one to have declared the end of the international investment regime, at this research forum and so on. I know that this is exciting to say these things in a zeitgeist where everybody's talking about uncertainty and contestation, but I think being a little slow and maybe being a little sober is an advantage of our scholarship. Also, I think the fine-grained aspect of what we do is really helpful, because we cannot very easily generalize as a discipline. And excuse any IR scholars amongst us here, because I think they're more sort of prone to this type of thing, because we always have a counter story somewhere else. We can say, well, there's this issue, but then there was this other example that happened in another place. So we immediately contextualize, and we can't really say that this has exactly happened. I mean, I find it very difficult to say that the liberal international order has ended or something like that. I just can't make this type of sentences, because I also have serious doubts about when it started, or whether we had a liberal international order. And I think the international lawyers are a little bit more sober with these types of statements, because we know that consensus is so fragile, and is it really that consensus is a lot more fragile right now than it was in 1999? I think some international lawyers will think about this. They wouldn't just say, yes, 100%, it was definitely, this and that and the other. So I find this sobering perspective about how everything is actually maybe, this building grand narratives is something that we actually push back against as a discipline. And I find this a healthy interjection into these types of debates because we question these meta-narratives. And I think it's a very important part of our scholarship that we don't jump and produce the meta-narratives that are created by others, but we actually ask whether this meta-narrative actually holds. And I find that a very important part of our scholarship, to be more sober, maybe a bit more boring, but boring is necessarily not bad scholarship, I would say, and maybe less sensational. The second way I think we can really interject into these debates that are sort of ongoing, and of course it's a very big debate. The debate is not just amongst international lawyers, but amongst policymakers, and everybody else is talking about these issues, is that I think we are experts. Shall I say that? Experts are not very well looked upon these days, but we are experts in studying norm resilience. You can say, well, there are others as well who study norm resilience. Fine, everyone studies norm resilience these days, but I think as international lawyers, we're particularly interested and very well equipped methodologically to study norm resilience. So we are not sort of very quickly sort of jumping down and saying this norm is changing and this is from day to be, this is how it's changing. We are very interested in both in narrative and on empirical terms to actually study how norms are resisting. This is bread and butter of our scholarship. And I think this is an area where we will make some of the most important contributions in the coming decade to come, is to increase and sort of interject into debates about how we study norm resilience. And there's lots of really good examples of that, I think, already in existing scholarship, in particular those who study the right to self-defense, those who right to self-defense and the non-state actors, and the various sort of changes that have been happening. The international lawyers are very much into really looking at the very fine tuning details, because that's what we spend a lot of time studying and thinking to work and question these issues. And of course, one way that is connected to norm resilience about what we do and what we can contribute to the discussions is we are also a little bit of experts in studying illegality. We're quite good at that. And this links with our studies of norm resilience, but we are able to say that a certain action at a certain time was unlawful. And we have said it in the past, and we will continue to say this. So there's nothing new about it, but this is how we're able to interject into these bigger debates. And I think, when I have debates with policymakers, there's always this moment, maybe you have experienced this moment, they kind of all look at you and say, was that lawful? And there's a moment where they want you to tell, whether, of course there are all these other issues, but was that lawful? So there's a moment, there's a corner of scholarship that we produce it, and, you can say, well, who cares if we studied illegality? Who cares if we actually wrote down the illegality? This is what's been happening right here in this jurisdiction for many, many years. We're at the heart of a lot of illegalities. But of course, this is the way we interject into these conversations by very carefully studying notions of illegality. This is the strength of our, I think, scholarship in this regard. Now, the third area, I think, where we are able to, and we have very seriously interjected into these debates, and I think this is a very unique and important part of our scholarship, is that we also study norm adaptation and sort of incremental changes in norms. And there's been lots of study about this, in relation to various areas about strategic adaptation or norm adjustment, how norms are adjusted, how they're adapted in various fora. And one area of research that's really close to my heart, has generated a lot of scholarship in this regard, which is the European Court of Human Rights. And I know there are quite a few papers on the European Court of Human Rights and how they interject as an interpretive institution to this zeitgeist of retreat and sort of new sovereignty. I'm looking at a judge here. Of course, I'm not necessarily talking about your views. But of course, what we have seen, and I think this is one area that we are able to tell people this fine-grained story, is that how international institutions are adapting to this new environment. And I think this is an area that we have all excelled in studying, how different international institutions have adapted to this new sovereignty. So there's been a very important literature on proceduralization of international law, as well as sort of the new deference doctrines in international law. These are the areas where we're actually studying and are able to put certain things on the table. How do we, though, make sense of institutions and institutional interactions in the age of retreat? One area that I've recently started studying, so this is, how do I study in the age of decline kind of a situation, is I'm very, for example, interested in how different institutions strategically adapt to the new sovereignty environment. So because there's not a single story about how different international bodies do this. On the one hand, for example, we have the European Court of Human Rights and its strategic adaptation or strategic retreat type of scholarship. And on the other hand, we have the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which has a completely different music tune to sort of exactly what's happening and what kind of interpretation is happening. And if you compare it to something like the Committee Against Torture in the United Nations, we also see that very different institutions and different environments are acting in very different ways in this new sort of sovereignty environment. So this type of research, for example, really interests me, because it also shows that this is not a one-directional sort of retreat type of a story, but the retreat is actually very multidimensional, and sometimes very unexpected institutions may become heroes, and very unexpected institutions may become villains in this story. So, I have personally not thought, where the European Court of Human Rights will be here studying its case law at the end of 1990s. So for me, it's a very interesting story, a very surprising story of strategic adaptation, as opposed to some of the other institutions. So these are some areas I think that we're able to say a lot more about things than maybe other disciplines or other scholars. As a conclusion, not a conclusion, maybe as a conversation starter, when I was looking at papers at the research forum, I was thinking, what kind of research, who fits into my themes, what kind of discussion is there? And what I'm finding is there's a lot of research in this forum, and maybe this is a body of research that we will see, is on this strategic adaptation of international institutions. That seems that this has captured a lot of the audience and their interests in what do we study, how do we study international law in the age of retreat. This seems to be a very sort of a solid area. And of course, I've also seen papers that actually inject this very sober perspective. It's not the end of the world. There are all these other micro stories, and so these are also meta-narrative, disturbing type of research. So I have also seen that. So some of the things I thought what we can do also seems to map to some of the scholarship that we will listen to in the coming 2 days. I think the scholar that I was, talking about, and he was very excited. He was saying, there's lots of prospects of innovation, a lot of a prospect of change. As I started in the beginning, I don't share that sort of an excitement, that there's going to be a very exciting times. But I also think that this is a very important time to do international law scholarship, and to do it in a very responsible way, because the meta-narratives are very powerful. They're telling us that things are changing, they're shifting from one direction to the other. And as scholars, sometimes it's very difficult to kind of go against these kind of big wisdoms. And the one that, for example, I really don't like is the end of the liberal, what was it? The liberal international order, because I don't even understand what that means. So I'm kind of even taking a step back and say, I don't understand this as an international lawyer, what this means. So I think this is a very important time for us to do responsible scholarship, and also to be able to have conversations with others who are having a scholarship about the international legal system, but maybe not with lawyers. So those are the two things that I'd like to highlight. We can be happy about our strengths when we're doing this type of research, but I think it's very important that we also cross boundaries to other disciplines and to have international law scholarship heard a lot more in areas where there's a lot more of a sensationalist, sort of this big meta, sort of grand narrative type of research is being done. So with that note, I invite you to do more responsible international law research, which I'm sure you're all doing, but also to see that we also have a responsibility to sometimes correct some of these meta-narratives and the sensationalist sort of discourses by bringing what we do best to the table. Thank you.
We have a few minutes before the group photo. We would like to take on some questions or observations, ruminations. Anne.
I maybe just want to follow up on Basak's remark that there have been a lot of research out there on the question of what's happening in this globalized order, and maybe the title should be Our International Law in Times of Disorder and Contestation, because if you look at what's happening, and I would always read Danny Roderick, whom I adore, just obviously as you do, who basically talks about the paradox of globalization. It's very difficult to have open markets, a state and democracy at the same time. So the more you go into depth and you regulate as international law, the more it will be contested. Adding to this, I would suggest to read Richard Baldwin, which is basically talking about, who is teaching at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, an economist, the Great Convergence. That's a very optimistic title, and why is that? Because the great divergence took place when we, the West, industrialized, getting all the world income. Now that's changing, because with information technology we can move the ideas. And with the ideas we outsource highly productive jobs. So it's contested from within. There's a whole bunch, there's an Oxford handbook research on international political economy, looking at how trade impacts democracy, what are the internal interests, who has an interest of not being globalized, and all this. This is research which has been done for a long, long, long time. So if you want to understand what's happening with trade in Brexit or Trump, I think that is something we need to look at. There's a second thing which I would like to say, because I think there is something like a liberal international order. It's also mine. But I'm not saying it's everybody's, but it's mine, and I actually like it. There are certain elements, like you like the human rights. I think it's part of it. But what I'm missing in this whole dialogue is this: there are people out there contesting this, either in our countries, in the West, in the United States, in Great Britain, in Hungary, in Poland, wherever. But those are other people. We don't have anything to do with it because we are the elite. And I find that very difficult. I find everybody here needs to ask themselves what we are doing, what we are not doing, what's the personal responsibility. And to give you an example, a month ago, there was research published on the arbitration done by international court justices. Most of the justices of the international court, sitting judges, are sitting on arbitrations, earning a lot of money, being occupied with issues which might come up at one point to the court. So there's a clear conflict of interest, and I think wording is never clear. We know this as lawyers, but the original procedures of the court were pretty clear that they should not be sitting on any other legal
Tribunal.
Yes. They do it nevertheless. Now, how easy is it for any state which loses in front of the court to say that those judges are conflicted, they are not independent, they are politicized, and they are just working for their own pocket? It's the easiest thing to do. So what does that mean for us, Basak? And so I think here again I would go for what can we contribute as lawyers, is at least to say, if there is personal responsibility missing, we try to put the morals and the ethic in the rules. Because hitherto we were expecting them to somehow either have personal ethics, which obviously they don't, or not all of them. There are some judges, they're well aware. There are some judges, sitting judges on the court, who say explicitly, I would never do this because that might impact the legitimacy of the court. Others don't do that and make that court contestable. So what we can do is say, well, we draft procedures, or at least suggest procedures, to make it more legitimate. That is an issue. The same thing as we do with investment tribunals, for example, right? So this is where we can try and work. But again, what I would like to say here, and that is really important to me, and that concerns academics as well, everybody who is part of this elite or intellectual elite has personal responsibility in times of contestation of certain fundamental values, where I believe, which I believe are important. So not everybody needs to believe that. And I'm saying this as a German national, because we have experience with what happens so quickly with lawyers when the regime changes. Sorry, that was like my passionate statement.
We start off at a good ground. So is there an international liberal order? Okay, yes.
You made the point that you were meeting somebody and who saw kind of potential and opportunities out there, and you said you couldn't share this kind of optimism. Nevertheless, first of all, have you asked him for his kind of vision about opportunities? And also, have you then reflected after talking with him whether there would also be opportunities to your field in a way, because you portrayed it in a way that it was very influential for you, very important, this kind of a discourse and this misunderstanding or non-understanding of this other position?
Maybe we should take some more. There are lots of hands. You should go first. And, yeah.
May I follow up? I think that for those of us who have internalized the values of the former period, like me, so we are quite disappointed. And then we believe that currently international law, it is in decline. Yeah, but of course the people who have different values, they may well be very happy about this change in values. But I think that as we are also scholars, I mean that during unsettled times, it is much more interesting. Someone very well known from California, Hans Wheeler, she said that during unsettled times, taken for granted or largely invisible features of society, suddenly they are exposed, and then we can address them more seriously. So perhaps it is indeed an exciting period for scholars.
Yes.
My question would be unrelated to that debate, so.
Yeah.
I just have a general question, also related to what Anna van Aken just said. Like, what is the role of legal scholarship in this debate? So yesterday we talked about legal practice, and of course legal practice has a different role to play. But I was wondering about legal scholarship. I think because there are several trends we see there too, like especially in the methodology. Lots of people now go back to history. Like we see this rise of Polanyi literature in law now. We see a rise of Marxian literature in law. And on the other hand, we see a rise of empirical research, which also tries to at least identify. But I was wondering, like, in between history and social science and economics, what is the role of the legal methodology in times of disorder and contestation, or is it only practice?
That's a fascinating question. I will like to answer that. But I have yes.
So I think from several of the comments and from the example that you gave with the more senior academic, one issue that we should think about is who is doing the contestation. And I think there is a difference between contestation from within and from without. And we sometimes tend to think about our community of international lawyers as homogeneous, but in fact, it is very fragmented. And so we have lots of contestation from within the international law community, let's say. We have lots of arguments about the meaning of different legal regimes or different legal norms. And I think that contestation from within also intensifies or triggers even some of the contestation from without, because we have ourselves to deal with first, and then we can figure out how other people who are not lawyers, who are outside of our community, feels or think about the things that we do or our institutions. So that's something that I would be happy to discuss further.
No, I mean, these are, maybe I'll come back to this optimism or this sort of excitement. I think some of the regimes and their excesses. I think Anne was talking about the sort of excess of over-regulation, and some of that. That there's been a lot of reactions, and maybe we're entering into a corrective period. That international law had excesses of certain types, especially in trade regulation and so on and so forth. So that when you have this sort of critiques or the retreat is actually a corrective form. So my colleague was actually, I think, a little bit hopeful about that, because he had a view that this project gone a little too far, and that here was an opportunity to correct. And some people also call it this corrective populism, right? That populism is also a corrective force. It's not an evil force. It actually is able to rebalance certain things. And that's what excited him. This possibility of correction, and that the law could actually play a role in this correction, in this type of a situation. And I think his perspective was more on the trade and investment side of international law. And I think my different perspective was coming from the international human rights law perspective, because the corrective discourse has also been used, that we have overinterpreted human rights, and therefore we have a backlash, and now this is the era of corrective international law, which I don't share. That the corrective international law metaphor works for international human rights law as I see it. It may work better for trade and for investment law. So it was a bit like we were coming into this notion of contestation or uncertainty from very different maybe perspectives, and I couldn't share in full enthusiasm his excitement for correctiveness, of how the social forces were correcting some of the things that were facilitated by international law. But I also had to recognize that perspective. I think, coming back to what you were saying, it's not just all doom. This will be a very limited understanding of that this is all about we're all doomed and this is going in this type of direction. But I never thought that it was always a doom either, right? I mean, this is not where I, as a international lawyer, see the situation, because I always thought that consensus was incredibly fragile. I never came to the liberal order saying that there was this very clear consensus, but it was constantly, there were lots of incremental or a lot of regional contestations of this from where I see international law. If I look at it from Ankara, I just see it very differently, but I did see it differently also in 1994. So it's not just Erdogan made me see things differently, because there are continuities of contestation that just didn't happen, I think, in the past few years, sort of sort of either. You're right about historicizing. I was talking to an historian, a colleague of mine, and she said, "Oh, just go back to the 19th century. Give a keynote about what happened in the because that's at times of crisis. You go back and see what happened in the Concert of Europe, sort of thing." I'm not well equipped to historicize, so I can't do that. But I think international lawyers, what do we have? We study legality. I think we do it reasonably well. Between economics and sociology and history, I think there is a little area for us that's carved, sandwiched between maybe philosophy and law, somewhere there in between. So I think this is where we come in. We are able to have a claim to study legality. And I think this is a very important, obviously from different theoretical perspectives, but this is where we claim territory, I think, and we can't leave it to anybody else. I would say it's not a good idea to leave that area either.
So please join me in thanking Basak.